Well, here we are, the end of another tumultuous month, and that means another Q&A. As ever, I wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who posted questions. It really was a bumper crop this month, so much so that I'm going to split it into two parts. I'll put the second part up on Friday, so please keep an eye out for that. And with that, let's get started. So, Asraf Chowdhury asks, what do you make of the quick ceasefire between Pakistan and India, and will it hold? Asraf, thank you so much for this because, of course, it was a very nervous moment. You know, we had seen the horrific attack that took place in India and the fact that India claimed, and not without reason, that, you know, that the attackers may well have had some sort of, there may well have been some sort of Pakistani role. I'm being very circumspect on this because, you know, we don't have any clear evidence for that. I think there is a weight of evidence to say that both India and Pakistan have been supporting groups, militant groups that have been fighting. So, for example, you know, against Pakistani authorities in Balochistan, that Pakistan has been supporting groups that are fighting against India in Kashmir. I'm also a little bit careful on this because I think that what I find is that many Indians won't accept that there is an issue in Kashmir, and it's very easy just to say Pakistan has put people up to it. It's, you know, the people in Kashmir are entirely happy with the situation. They're clearly not. There has been an insurgency. It's declined in recent years, but there are political problems. There is a lot of people who are unhappy with the whole way that the Kashmir situation emerged. I've done videos on it. I'll try and put a link above. And as I've said, it's an incredibly complex situation. I think what really worries me in all of this is, so on the one hand, it's really good news that it seems that tensions have reduced. What worries me is that this is a problem that seems to have no solution in sight. And that means that it will continue to be a point of friction between India and Pakistan for the foreseeable future. And I think as we've seen, we're talking about two nuclear-armed states that have been to war a number of occasions. All right, it's been best part of quarter of a century since they've had a really serious outbreak of fighting, although we did apparently, you know, see shelling across the line of control on this particular incident. But I think this is something that we have to be super aware of and really aware of, that this is not an issue that's going to be solved anytime soon. And when you have got two countries with deep antipathy towards each other and a history behind it, and have nuclear weapons, that as good as it is to see a ceasefire, the worry is it will only hold until the next attack, next bombing, next shooting, next incident, whatever it might be. So yeah, I obviously, like everyone else, welcome what we've seen, but I'm very, very worried about what this holds for the future. AR4323 asks, is there anything you want to add to the election of a new Catholic Pope? What kind of geopolitical actions are expected to be seen, or what precedents were there? So look, two things. I wouldn't claim to be particularly religious, and I'm not Catholic, so I'd probably come at it in a bit of a different way. But I have to say, I was absolutely fascinated by it. I mean, you know, this is, you know, the death of a pope, that is death of a head of state, a unique position in world politics. In, you know, so if you like, forget the spiritual and religious side of it. I mean, it's also a really interesting and important political position. And you've got this amazing spectacle of a process of election of a new leader of the Catholic Church, a new leader of, you know, the Vatican, of you know, the Holy See as a state. So I'm fascinated by it, and you know, was watching it really closely and sort of following, you know, the names that were being put forward, and really interested in the geographical split, not just simply because of a geographical split, but also recognition that different parts of the world have rather different viewpoints on sort of church teaching, and that in itself has quite significant knock-on effects. And like I think everyone else, when it was announced, and I have to say, if I might say, I was desperately proud that as they were reading out the announcement in Latin, that I caught the name Leo XIV before it was translated into English. So what? My schoolboy Latin held up remarkably well. Thank you to my Latin teacher from probably about 45 years ago now. But just on that note, the election of an American Pope, I mean, was just absolutely mind-blowing in many ways. Nobody would have thought. And then to realise the background of the new Pope, and that, yes, he was American, but he'd spent most of his career in Latin America, in Peru, that he came from an order which was renowned for living in poverty and living within communities. And that, also the tweets or X's or whatever we call it these days, where he'd actually been rather critical of the Trump administration, I think gave a lot of people. And the fact that he didn't speak in English in his first papal address, that when he went out there, it was Latin, it was Italian, it was Spanish, it was that very clear message that I may be an American, but I'm not your typical American, if you like, that, is going to come in and speak English and everything like that. I've lived elsewhere, that I'm accepted in Latin America. I'm one of them, and I want them to know that. So I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and it will be really, really interesting to see what he is able to do. The fact that he's a lot younger and seems to be in good health, hopefully so. I'm fascinated to see, and be really, really interested in what direction he takes Catholicism. As I say, I'm not Catholic. I don't claim to be particularly religious, but I do recognise that this is the largest of the Christian churches, and for many, many millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions of people around the world, this is what he says carries a weight of one degree or another. So this is an incredibly influential role. And even on people who aren't Catholics, his involvement in conflict, his ability to sort of be a voice, a moral voice, hopefully, I think could be incredibly important. So, as I say, I watched with incredible amounts of interest on all sorts of levels. And, I hope he works out well. And obviously, I think, like many others, would wish him well in what is, by all accounts, an incredibly difficult job. Ibrahim Kalmati asks, how can we improve the enforcement of international law? Ibrahim, thank you so much for this, because, again, this is one of those questions that I think people who are regular viewers of the channel know that I think about a lot. That very much my approach to international relations is very much centred on international law and trying to uphold international law, not because it's perfect, but because it provides a structure that I think by and large has served the international community remarkably well. And I think that we are really at a time now where there's a real danger that that's breaking down. And so, while many will say, but this is terrible, and I completely agree, we've also got to be thinking, well, what can we do to try and preserve it? And it's a tough question to answer at the moment, because it's just breaking down in so many different ways. What we're seeing, for example, in Ukraine is a really, really clear example of the norm of respecting the boundaries of other countries being broken in a fundamental way, a war of aggression that's been waged, and other countries taking leads on that. So, when we see Venezuela making threats against Guyana, for example, these are very, very real examples where that fundamental principle is breaking down. I think we also have to recognise what is taking place with Israel. So, and I'm just going to be really straight on this one. I've always been someone who believes that, the right of Israel to exist as a state is beyond question. And we have to recognise the extent of what's happening in Gaza at the moment. And, South Africa brought a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice on genocide. The court effectively said, we are going to keep a close watch on that. I think it's probably about time that, that the court revisits this in a very, very serious way, because I think all the evidence is mounting that what we're seeing there does amount to genocide and intent of ethnic cleansing. And I'm fully aware of the seriousness of that. But I think, we have got to a point where more and more countries now are just having to face the reality of what is going on there. And that is important, not just because of the effect that it has on millions of ordinary Palestinians, but it also is very important because this is something that many other countries look at and see this as a fundamental double standard from the West. And I think that this is something that we have to recognise, that at the same time as we can be very critical, and rightly so, of what Russia is doing, I think it also, very often Western policymakers are not aware of how other countries often see Western behaviour. And it's something that I become very, very acutely aware of doing the channel, because this will come up time and time and time again in the comments, that what about this? What about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? And, I've made my positions on those very clear. And, I think Afghanistan, there was an argument for self-defence. Iraq was a disaster. We know that it was a disaster. And there was overreach amongst the West. And how we now claw that back is the really big question. Can we claw this back? How can we get countries to start respecting international law again? And I think this is the big debate that we're probably all having at has that, use the old sort of phrase, has that horse bolted? Is it no chance now to get back to those principles of international law? I mean, part of me says that, and again, this is a position that I've made clear before, when we talk about the Ukraine war, why I feel very strongly about it is because I do believe that it is a systemic war. I think that if Russia wins and the principle that you can seize territory by force is reintroduced into international relations, it will fundamentally affect the international system for the rest of this century. And this is part of the reason why I'm very, very insistent that I think that Russia needs to be defeated in Ukraine. But it's not just about that. It's then what happens after that. How then does the international community come together and say, right, okay, we have got to find a way back to international law, and not one that what you will have is Western countries saying, well, you do this while they do something else. I think that, again, Western policymakers also have to realise that if they want peace and stability, if they want an international system based on the international rule of law, then they are absolutely going to have to take a look in on themselves and sort of see where they've made their mistakes and commit not to do that in future. And it's not just about lecturing other countries, you can't do this while they do it. But of course, none of this is going to be able to happen unless you have a US administration which is willing to go along with this as well and start to say, right, okay, we understand the value of international law. And unfortunately, I think under the Trump administration, there's just absolutely no chance of that happening. So what we're seeing at the moment, I really do believe is an incredibly dangerous time. And a very bleak time as well, because it's very difficult to see how this is going to be fixed. And, you raise a great question. And as, again, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this in the comments below. How do you see this? Is there a way back from that? Or are we just going to have to accept that we are now living in a radically different world and a radically more dangerous world? A return to sort of 19th century might makes right. And what will that mean for smaller countries across the globe? Alex Winnie 274 asks, how do you see the future role of the BRICS changing due to the geopolitical disunity being created by the Trump administration in the West? Alex, thanks for this. So, this is a really, really great question, because it's something I think there's a lot of talk at the moment, isn't there, about the BRICS, or there has been, about how it's enlarging and everything. I'm more on the skeptical end about the BRICS. For a number of reasons. I know it's not because I come from a Western country. I have my skepticism because I think that they don't have a unifying ideology beyond the fact that they're not the West. There are lots of differences between members, so people often will talk, and I'm aware that there's a bit of a thawing of relations going on between India and China at the moment. But, when you've got, 2 of the 5 big members of the BRICS who have had a historically very difficult relationship with each other, it doesn't give you a lot of sort of sense that this is going to be, a particularly unified body, a particularly unified group. But in many ways, I think the one that I find most interesting in all of this is of course, China. For a number of reasons, because it strikes me that China is probably finding it very difficult at the moment to work out what its strategy is going to be. So on the one hand, it has authoritarian leanings. It sort of feels that it can take on the West, and it can build up a group of like-minded states around it. It's forging this relationship with Russia. But that's at the political level. At an economic level, it seems that, for example, China's probably asking itself, especially everything going on with the United States, how do we build up our relationship with other major world economic powers, including Europe, for example? And I think that this is probably putting Beijing into a very interesting situation where it's starting to think politically we might be more inclined towards supporting, Moscow and what's going on there. It's another partner in the BRICS. But where the wealth generation for China is coming from, especially with all the difficulties with the United States, is probably opening up and maintaining good trading relations with Europe. And so I think it's probably a really, really interesting debate that China's having about how it deals with this, how it builds up its leadership. How can it step in, for example, so as the United States pulls away from international organizations such as the United Nations? Should China be taking up the slack, and will that build its leadership? So essentially, what does China want to be out of all of this, I guess, is the question I'm asking. And I'm not entirely sure. And again, as always, look, please do let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about it. But it does strike me that decision makers in Beijing will probably be thinking very much at the moment at the same time as and especially now that Trump's announced that, well, for this week, that he's going to slap taxes on the EU, that it may well be the case that the EU and I think the EU is going to respond in rather the same way that China did, which is, all right, okay, do your worst, and then watch, the United States back down. But I could definitely see that Beijing might be thinking to itself, well, this is a really good opportunity to be building up better relations with the European Union. And of course, look, there are a lot of skeptics in the European Union about China. There are lots of questions about its political ambitions. There's lots of questions about its human rights record. But again, I think that there will also be those who will be saying, well, look, if this is an opportunity now to use economics to split China off from Russia, for example, then is that something that could be worth pursuing? And so on that one, I think, Europe and the United States have a very different view of China and where the challenge lies and how to respond to it. So in many ways, I'm not really convinced that BRICS is about to take off at the moment as a result of what we're seeing. I know a lot of people want to see it do that because they'd love to see the West getting a kicking, and they think that BRICS will do it. I just don't see that happening. And in many ways, I think that there are better outlets for the big developing or global South to be focusing on, to build ties with like-minded Western states that they can work with. So, I think G20, for example, is a much better body in many ways for many of these countries to invest their time and efforts in. But the BRICS is there, and we'll see, could be proven wrong by it. But at the moment, I'm just not seeing any sort of unifying vision that comes out of this. So Virginia Taliaferro 76, who's also a channel member, asks, I've heard you mention a return to 19th century realpolitik for the international system with the decline of an institutional rules-based order. Are there any other relevant historical time frames? It's also been popular in the US to compare the current situation to the end of the Roman Republic, for example. Virginia, look, this is really, really great question, because you're absolutely right, and I think it is really interesting, isn't it, how we refer to history and international relations and drawing on that. And you're right. I mean, I often say that one of my concerns about what we're seeing happening in international relations at the moment is that it is very, very reminiscent of 19th century. Are we returning to that sense of realpolitik where, might makes right, that if countries have the power to invade neighbours, seize territory, they will just go ahead and do that. But I think also you're absolutely right that, for the classicists, who are looking at what's happening in the United States and under the Trump administration, this idea that somehow rot is setting in. That you have the US Republic, and I think many, many serious observers believe that it is in critical danger, that there is a really good chance that it won't survive this Trump administration, and certainly not in the way that people had become comfortable about and used to. That so many of the norms of the US political system have been breaking down, and many of the checks and balances that everyone took for granted have been weakened, have disappeared, disintegrated. And again, I should point out that, I often say, and speaking to American friends, that I am really struck by the parallels with Brexit, that what we're seeing at the moment. And Brexit, again, it was a really traumatic time in the UK, and a lot of the political rules broke down, a lot of the established conventions, a lot of the understandings about how British politics should be carried out disappeared. And I think we're seeing that obviously on a much, much greater scale in the United States. Now, I know there'll be people who are saying, oh, well, this is overplayed and it's Trump derangement syndrome and all that nonsense. No, this is really quite serious when you have a leader who is passing all sorts of executive orders. And, let's think for a moment, the word dictator, dictates what's going to happen. And that is exactly what is happening with this, these endless executive orders. It's just bypassing Congress. It's saying, this is how it's going to be. This is what I have decided it's going to be. And this is what it will be. And we're not seeing a pushback against this. And it's really weak. And, the media, I don't think, seems to have a proper grasp on it. The seriousness of it. Hopefully it's now starting to cut through, and we're seeing in all sorts of different ways. But again, it's rather like the question on international law. What is the way back from all of this? With every passing day that this becomes more normalized. And the question is then, will the Democrats be able to will they reverse this? And you know what? I think a lot of people will say, oh, but of course, if the Democrats win, they'll reverse this. A lot of people thought that when Labour won in the UK that they would reverse a lot that was going on, but they've been far more cautious, that, people start to worry that they're going to upset a lot of people. And so I'm not quite as confident that everything will go back to normal if the United States voted for Democrat, president next time round. A lot of the damage will be done. And, even if you can restore many of the norms of democratic politics again, not Democrat politics, but democratic, republic politics, that in so many other ways damage will have been done, which will probably never be fixed. You can start to reconstitute agencies as well, but then you start getting into spending a lot of money, and that becomes a political hot potato, along with all the other things that have got to be done. So, I think that people are too complacent about the damage that's been done, and I think probably too complacent about how it's going to be fixed. And so this is when you do start to see these parallels, and people saying, well, it has this, is this like the end of the Roman Republic, and when everything fell apart, and you saw what happened, and then you entered, the imperial Rome, is imperial United States starting. I think we have to also be a bit careful. I'm fully aware as well that, as much as Trump and his dynasty of family members, I'm not sure whether we're going to see any of it pass from one family member to another. So that might give a little bit more hope for things. But as I say, I'm a little bit cautious about anyone who just sort of thinks we need to just ride out Trump and then everything will be fixed again. I don't think it's going to be nearly as simple as that. But no, I think great question, though, about, as I say, the historical parallels. And it is interesting to look at this, isn't it? And sort of see, well, this is why I think, those of us who've got a bit of a background in history find this very interesting, because it is that way of pulling on things and sort of informing and saying, listen, we've seen stuff like this happen before. But of course, always being careful to recognise that the particular context is very different today. So, Visions of Shmuel ask, will Israel and Saudi Arabia ever normalise their relationship, and will other Gulf states join the Abraham Accords? If you'd asked me in mid-2023, so coming up for 2 years ago, I would have felt that it was possible. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the huge prize for Israel. Let's not... there's no getting around it. I mean, and Iran will be in time, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. But we did see this. And I think it is important to mention that, for all the criticism we can, and I think rightfully, heap on Trump, many would regard the Abraham Accords during his first term, which is when he got 4 Arab countries to recognize Israel. So that was United Arab Emirates, it was Bahrain, it was Morocco, and it was Sudan to recognize Israel. This was, the largest number of new countries ever to recognize Israel in certainly in the past 2 or 3 decades. And I think Trump really saw this as his great achievement. And I mean, it was controversially done, especially, for example, in the case of Morocco, because the United States said, in return for this, we will recognise Western Sahara as under Moroccan authority, sovereignty, and that was a really controversial move. But I think it's really, really interesting to see how I think he wanted to play on that. But of course, what we've seen with the Hamas attack, but Israel's attack on counter against Gaza and how far it's gone, has made it absolutely politically impossible for any Arab states to normalise relations with Israel. And I suspect that, we've been hearing a lot about Trump's very difficult relationship with Netanyahu. And I suspect that a lot of that might come down to the fact that Trump now recognises that what he wanted to do, and frankly he could and could have done it, is to be that great bridge between the remaining Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Israel. And the reality is that even though Saudi Arabia and Israel didn't have formal diplomatic relations, Saudi Arabia doesn't recognise Israel, relations were building. They were talking to each other. They were engaged. But it's just politically impossible now for Saudi Arabia or any other country to do it. And I think Trump maybe feels that Netanyahu has pushed things so far that he's stolen that opportunity for Trump to get a whole bunch more countries to recognize Israel. And we saw that very high-profile visit around the Gulf states. He obviously, for all the criticism he gets in other parts of the world and all the concern that other parts of the world have about what's going on, the Gulf states, he got a warm welcome there. Saudi Arabia has just dumped a lot of money on the United States in new sort of defense contracts and things like that. So it was certainly within the realms of possibility, and maybe this is what he saw as being his achievement. The other one, of course, which is going to be really interesting, is the Iran nuclear talks. There's been a thawing of relations with Saudi Arabia. Trump has his eye on doing that, and I think that in many ways might help to build a relationship between the Gulf countries and Iran. So that could be a really, really, maybe that's where he's turned his attention to. And again, all of this could be sort of playing into the difficult relationships that he has with Netanyahu at the moment. Quite how this is all squared, I'm not quite sure, but I mean, I think this is the problem that one often deals with when talking about Trump. But I think it is a really, really great question. And so the answer is no. I don't see any more countries joining the Abraham Accords anytime soon. I think what's happened in Gaza has just made that politically impossible for a very, very long time. Quartercast asks, how impressed are you with Marco Rubio's performance over the past 5 months, given doubts you had earlier to his resilience? Look, I'd love to say that I've changed my opinion on Rubio. I haven't. In fact, actually, I think in many ways it's my opinion has gone down because the longer and longer he's stayed in there, the longer and longer he's been parroting positions that he knows are wrong, that in many cases are immoral, has just come as a real disappointment. And I know that most foreign policy observers feel the same way. And, you could say, but he's trying to moderate things. No, that's not how it works in Trump. You don't moderate things in that way. He's gone along with closing USAID, which has had a hugely negative impact around the world. And again, I know there'll be lots of people cheering it on. And, and I have to, so I'm going to be very honest here. I hear Trump saying, we've got to stop the war in Ukraine because, so many people are getting killed. The number of people being killed in Ukraine, as horrific as it is, will be in the shadows of the number of people who will die as a result of the cuts to USAID in the coming years. I mean, the people who are going to be affected by hunger, the people who are going to be affected by disease, all of this is going to be huge. And yet, as I say, Rubio's gone along with that. He didn't put up a case to say he knew. This was somebody in Congress who'd taken a very strong position in Ukraine. He sat there on that sofa and allowed Zelensky to be mugged in the way that he was. He's been parroting, Trump's talking points on this. No, sadly, I'd like to think that, he would be the grown-up in the room. I'm just not seeing any evidence of it. And I think the other thing is, this is somebody who has political ambitions. And I think if he's got any sense whatsoever, he'll know now that, moderate Republicans will never vote for him now. He's thrown his lot in with Trump. So if he wants to appeal to be the next MAGA leader when Trump disappears from the scene, assuming he doesn't run for a third term or anything, then, he's going to have to play to that. So, I don't see him moderating his behaviour because he's going to be up against Vance, and Vance will play a much tougher MAGA role. So, I don't have a better opinion of what he's done. I think early on he could have gone out in glory and just said, listen, I signed up because I thought I could be a voice of moderation. I thought I could influence what's going on. I thought I could shape policy on Ukraine. But I haven't been able to, and so I'm stepping away from the role. And I think that would have put him in a far stronger position. But no, at this point, he's gone all in on it. Now, it might be, and again, please do let me know in the comments if you see things differently, that, maybe he is playing a longer game and that, he knows what he's up to, and that, slowly he's trying to work on Trump from within. I don't think he's that significant a voice to be able to do that, frankly. But again, I'd be interested to hear alternative views on that. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for. So don't forget to keep a lookout for the second part. I'll post it on Friday or put the link here. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.